Welcome to This Explainer. Let's jump right in, because today we're exploring something absolutely fascinating, the completely hidden world going on inside our own heads. We're going to unpack exactly how our brains secretly, and I mean constantly, shield us from emotional trauma, everyday anxiety, and honestly sometimes just the harshness of reality itself. Have you ever wondered why you react a certain way when you're super stressed out? Or, why some people just can't stop making jokes during actual tragedies? Well, by the end of this explainer, you're going to see your own behaviors, and definitely the behaviors of everyone around you, in a completely new light. Section 1. The Mystery of the Genie and the Fisherman. Okay, so to understand how our highly evolved modern minds work, we're actually going to start with a really old story. You're probably familiar with the classic 1001 Night's Tale, right? The one where a poor fisherman casts his net, pulls up this old brass jar, and frees a genie who's been trapped inside for centuries. But here is the bizarre twist that psychologists find so fascinating. Instead of granting the fisherman 3 wishes or, just saying thank you, the freed genie immediately announces that he is going to murder the man who just saved him. I mean, why on earth would he do that? Well, just look at how his mindset shifted over time. For the first 100 years, he was thinking, whoever frees me, I will reward with eternal wealth. After 200 years, he upgraded it, thinking, I'll just grant them all the earth's treasures. But by year 600 of being trapped in this tiny, dark jar, his mindset violently flipped to, I will kill whoever frees me. This is a brilliant illustration of the psychological concept of repression. See, the genie was furiously angry at King Solomon, the prophet who originally imprisoned him. But he couldn't exactly express that anger. So century after century, he just pushed that rage down, repressing it until it literally boiled over into a violent, explosive thirst for revenge. So the absolutely crucial point here is what happens to all that repressed rage. The genie can't realistically take his anger out on King Solomon. I mean, Solomon is a powerful prophet, so lashing out at him would cause massive internal guilt and severe consequences. So what does the genie's mind do? It uses a defense mechanism called displacement. Displacement is all about redirecting intense emotion from the original dangerous target to a much safer substitute target. The genie channeled his forbidden, centuries-old rage into attacking literally the very first random, innocent person he saw, our poor fisherman. It wasn't about the fisherman at all. It was just the mind's clever, albeit twisted way of finding a safe outlet for unbearable pressure. Section 2. The conflict of the 3 parts of the soul. So that story is a perfect metaphor, but let's actually look at the science behind it. What is realistically happening inside our minds to trigger these bizarre, seemingly irrational defensive reactions? To answer that, we turn to Sigmund Freud. He believed our mind is essentially split into 3 distinct parts that are pretty much constantly at war with each other. First up, you have the id. Think of the id as the most primal, pleasure-seeking part of yourself. It wants what it wants right now, and consequences be damned. Then, on the totally opposite end, you have the superego. This is your strict moral conscience, the demanding voice of societal rules that expects absolute perfection. Imagine the id and the superego as 2 incredibly stubborn, totally incompatible, bickering roommates who fundamentally hate each other. And caught right in the middle, that's the ego. The ego is like the stressed-out diplomat, just desperately trying to find a compromise so these 2 extreme forces don't completely tear your mind apart. When the id wants to lash out aggressively, but the superego is demanding perfect morality, the ego is put in an impossible position. And this is exactly where the psychological magic happens. Defense mechanisms are the ego's diplomatic tools. They're these totally subconscious strategies the ego uses to safely vent the dangerous pressure of the id, while still satisfying those strict rules of the superego. And it manages to do the whole shebang without destroying our self-esteem or completely breaking our grasp on reality. Section 3. Defense mechanisms in literature. Now that we actually understand the mechanics of this, what's really amazing is that long before modern psychology gave these mechanisms fancy names, brilliant writers were observing them in action. Consider Bashar ibn Burd. He was a highly prominent, yet deeply insecure poet from history. He was born blind, and his physical appearance made him the target of just relentless mockery and bullying his entire life. Because of that incredibly harsh physical and social reality, he harbored immense internal anger and profound feelings of inferiority. Yet listen to what he says in his poetry. He boldly claims that the supreme ruler, the caliph, takes after him. This perfectly illustrates the defense mechanism known as identification. Identification happens when we unconsciously adopt the characteristics of a powerful or successful person just to mask our own feelings of inadequacy. Bashar ibn Burd wasn't just bragging here. His ego was literally surviving. By equating himself with the single most powerful man in the empire, he was able to entirely ignore his painful physical reality, artificially inflate his self-worth, and protect his super fragile inner self from just crumbling completely. We see another incredibly powerful example in Naguib Mahfouz's famous novel The Thief and the Dogs. The main character, Said Mavran, is this desperate criminal who has lost absolutely everything: his freedom, his wife, and access to his beloved daughter, Sana. His reality is as dark as it gets, yet his words focus entirely on the smiling image of his estranged daughter. He's dreaming of this happy reunion that, logically, is practically impossible. Said is utilizing fantasy. Fantasy is the act of retreating into a dream world to escape a harsh, unmanageable reality. And it's incredibly common, especially among people who feel totally powerless or oppressed. Think about a teenager who gets relentlessly bullied at school. Instead of confronting that terrifying reality, they might spend hours daydreaming about being a superhero who swoops in and saves the whole school. It takes their unbearable daily humiliation and turns it into a fantasy of triumph and admiration. It's essentially the mind throwing a life preserver to a drowning ego. Section 4. How do we protect ourselves daily? Okay, so we've seen defense mechanisms at work in ancient myths and classic literature, but let's bring this out of the history books and directly into your life right now. How do we, as modern people, unconsciously protect ourselves day to day? Well, consider someone walking around with deep, potentially unacceptable anger or violent urges. If the primal id had its way, this person might commit a crime or get totally ostracized from society. But the ego steps in. It finds a socially acceptable reality for all that energy, like, say, joining a heavy contact sport like rugby or martial arts. This specific maneuver is a real game changer. It's called sublimation. It's the process of transforming unacceptable, destructive impulses into positive, socially celebrated actions. In fact, psychologists often consider sublimation to be one of the healthiest, most mature defense mechanisms we have. Instead of destroying a person's life, these really intense underlying urges get channeled into making them a disciplined, successful athlete, maybe a fierce but effective business leader, or even a passionate artist. It's a win-win. Another incredibly common and very positive tool is humor. Have you ever noticed how the absolute darkest times often produce the funniest jokes? Finding the comedy in our deepest tragedies is basically the ego's way of releasing the pressure valve. It makes unbearable pain momentarily manageable, it helps us bond with the people around us during a crisis, and it shrinks massive, terrifying problems down to a size our brains can actually process. Section 5. Are these mechanisms useful? So this brings us to a really critical crossroad in our explainer. If our minds are constantly tricking us, hiding our real emotions behind sports, jokes, and daydreams, are these mechanisms actually useful? Should we be working to completely dismantle these psychological walls, or is it better to leave them standing? To answer that, pioneering psychoanalyst Anna Freud pointed out how profound childhood trauma directly programs our lifelong coping strategies and even our careers. For instance, a child who suffers from extreme poverty and deprivation might use altruism to become a protective nanny later in life, ensuring other children never feel the lack of resources she felt. Or a child traumatized by losing a parent to cancer might use intellectualization to become an oncologist. They face their greatest fear by stripping away the raw emotion and replacing it with hard, cold scientific data and a mission to heal. However, a student terrified of an angry, abusive teacher might use identification with the aggressor. They grow up and mimic that exact same abusive behavior just to ensure they are never, ever the victim again. And honestly, that third example perfectly highlights the true danger of defense mechanisms, the intense battle between comfort and reality. While these mental tricks absolutely provide essential temporary relief that keeps us functioning, over-relying on them comes at a really steep cost. Because if you constantly hide behind humor, fantasy, or even altruism, you might never actually process your true feelings. You run the risk of living a life completely separated from reality, never maturing beyond the original pain that caused you to put those walls up in the first place. So, I want to leave you with this somewhat provocative thought to ponder today. Look inward and really examine your most passionate, rigid, or intense behaviors. Think about your career choices, your strongest arguments, your deepest habits. Are you truly attacking life head-on based on what you actually want? Or how you spent your whole life defending? Is it all just your ego working overtime behind the scenes, throwing up walls to protect your inner child from a pain you've been avoiding for years? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this helps you understand the fascinating machinery of your own mind just a little bit better.